cell vehicles. These are vehicles that are also electric. They use an electric motor, but instead of having a battery that's recharged, the power is produced by fuel cells on the bus that combine hydrogen and oxygen to produce electricity and heat and water. And you actually require hydrogen to fuel that bus. It fuels much faster than battery electric, a few minutes compared to a couple hours in terms of time difference, but that's another technology available on the market. There's also diesel electric hybrid buses, which similar to a Prius, for those of us kind of more familiar with the car space. Basically, it's a combination of an internal combustion engine and a electric propulsion system where there's a battery of really limited range. It gets its energy from regenerative braking. And you also have kind of that diesel or gasoline motor, depending on the vehicle, that supplements the propulsion system. So in broad strokes, that's kind of what the state of the market looks like for zero emission or low emission vehicles in the bus space.
Aaron or Cole, anything to add to that overview, to that broad overview of the different technologies?
That was a great overview. The only thing I might add is the third one is catenary lines, where buses actually, like you see in Boston, Seattle, where there's an arm that grabs a catenary line in the street and charges the vehicle as it drives down.
The good old electric trolley bus,
the good old electric trolley bus. Unfortunately, it's going out of style. I think
Mm-hmm.
Boston is getting rid of theirs, but I think Seattle's still planning on going strong with it. So.
And Jen and Aaron, anything regarding specifically some of those technologies? Are there, it sounds to me like it's interesting. Jen, you mentioned you need to store and use hydrogen as a fuel. As someone who is not an engineer, I think hydrogen, I think Hindenburg. Are there very different handling protocols, things like that have to do with the storage of hydrogen? Is it difficult to produce? How is that seen overall?
In broad strokes, so hydrogen definitely requires a fair amount of fuel sources that aren't entirely clean. So in terms of the clean energy perspective, there's kind of gray and green hydrogen. Ideally, you're producing hydrogen from hydropower, which is the kind of cleanest, most efficient source we have for generation. So that's one element. But I'll also mention transit bus fleets and to a certain extent, school buses have gone through the transition of CNG used to be the technology that was kind of the hot new sustainable thing. I think that we've moved past that as our kind of goals are more on the zero emission side of things. But definitely there's already been a transition towards a gas fuel as opposed to gas in terms of it being not a liquid, like a gas fuel, and having the fire safety concerns around that of fuel that floats as opposed to fuel that goes in the ground. So I think a lot of transit and bus agencies and districts have already dealt with the transition to a gas-based fuel who have adopted CNG.
Got it. Cole, any guidance you can give maybe in terms of what agencies in the US are seen as, and globally, not just in the United States, but globally, are seen as on the cutting edge of adopting some of these electric bus technologies, or any specific technology?
Sure. Well, I think first off, you have to give credit to Antelope Valley Transit Authority in California. They are now 100% electric fleet for all the fixed-route buses. And they're actually pioneering inductive charging for the electric buses as well, which is really exciting. When it comes to hydrogen fuel cell buses, AT Transit in Oakland has had them in the road for almost 20 years now, and they're very cutting edge with their maintenance training techniques. They've actually embraced a lot of virtual reality to train people. And I just got back from after in Seattle, so there might be some recency bias, but King County Metro in Seattle has been way ahead with their battery maintenance technology than anybody else. I mean, they were stealing used batteries from Priuses for their hybrid buses 15 years ago. So when it comes to battery electric buses, they're well positioned when it comes to the batteries. And they currently have a tester in their South Base right now where they're testing out 3 different chargers and putting them all through their paces to really figure out which is the best one for their operation. So I think they're well ahead, and we're going to be learning a lot from King County Metro in the next couple of years.
We're going to get into some of those trade-offs associated with the charging and the different charging technologies and what that means for operators like MTA and NJ Transit as well. What would you say is like the state of bus electrification nationally? Like if you could give maybe a percentage is asking too much, but how far along the road are we towards bus electrification nationally? Are there regional differences? Cole, you mentioned California, of course, typically on the if not the leading edge, the bleeding edge of air quality mandates and laws, right? And I think what is it now? California said no transit vehicles or there will be no gas vehicles, no internal combustion engine vehicles, new ones sold after 2035. I think transit fleets have an even earlier mandate. Correct me if I'm wrong. And from the California Air Resources Board, how does that, taking that, for example, how does that translate across the nation to different states and different regions? Are there ones that follow California that don't, et cetera?
Well, I'll say that, like you said, California usually these things kind of leads the way. And as an industry, we're definitely learning from everything that they've done over the past couple of years as they've been ahead of it. New York itself has a Clean Air Act that is coming out that is going to put very similar mandates as California, if not a couple of years behind. Massachusetts also has some pretty stiff mandates coming down for the transit agencies. So definitely people, kind of picking up what California leads. But I think the biggest driver is probably the IIJA and the $5 billion that is available over the next 5 years for zero emission and low emission vehicles. People are really taking advantage of this opportunity to take that money to transition their fleet. So
the infrastructure bill, to be clear.
Correct.
Right.
Yes, the infrastructure bill. So I think a lot of agencies around the country are really using that as a reason to kind of jump into it and learning. New Fly Industries, who is one of the biggest fixed route bus manufacturers, says that right now about 25% of all their orders are for electric buses, and I can only see that growing over the next couple of years.
Interesting. So we'll get into some of the elements of planning, unless Aaron, Lance, anybody have anything else to add in terms of that overall general picture? Thinking of the different technologies? No? Great. So understanding, obviously it's a New York Metro APA webinar. So we want to understand and get into some of the weeds in terms of planning and what does that mean for planning for the electrification of bus fleets, and things like, what are some of the, for example, what are some of the opportunities in transitioning to electrified fleets? Lance, in preparation for this, we had mentioned that some of the best practices sort of for zero emission fleets and facilities are things that can be learned from and obviously can be understood more fully, because there is so many different tracks and different types of technologies out there. Can you think of any that you could share that you think of as being a good example of what some of those fleets and facilities planning practices are, in general at first?
Yeah. So, I mean, when I talk to clients, the first thing is always, being flexible. Transit, we've been doing transit, rail, rubber tire, and steel wheel for a long time. And when you add battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell into that mix, it's going to change every aspect of your organization. And so we get in with people who've been operating buses for 30 years, and they're like, wait, you want us to do this and change service this way? And it's like,
right.
You have to adapt to the technology. And so with that, it's a huge culture change. And so on the planning side, making sure that every facet of your organization remains flexible, steadfast in some of your values and principles. We don't want to infringe on service and make, maintenance folks work harder, but we do have to be flexible with that. And then, engaging with your utility early, ensure that, your facility right now may have a peak demand of a megawatt, if that. And so when you're a several hundred bus facility and your peak demand is going to be, through the roof, we want to make sure that the utility knows that that's coming and that they prepare. And then, as with most things, you want to take an iterative approach to this. Basically, you're planning based off of existing conditions, a moment in time. But while you're planning for those existing conditions and future conditions, technology is changing, prices are changing, your service is changing. In a post-COVID world, we're still trying to understand ridership. And
right.
So, taking small bites of this apple at a time, I would say is one of the best practices for planning for a ZE fleet.
Aaron, you had mentioned to us in some of the prep that coordination with utilities that Lance just mentioned is pretty important, and with NJ Transit's experience, I guess that's something that to consider. Right, there are different utility providers in different part of the state. Your service area is pretty pretty large. Has that been an obstacle in any ways to implementing some of the charging infrastructure at bus operating and maintenance bases, or it's something that has not really been a huge concern?
Definitely, yeah, echoing that it's going to take a lot of coordination with our different utility providers in New Jersey. There's, 4 alone, and like you said, our service runs throughout the state. So I think talking with them early is going to be really important. We're kind of early in our bus electrification journey, and have only installed chargers at our one facility down in Newton. But just understanding that there are longer lead times, and each site is very specific and unique, and will have different constraints, not only in the layout, but also the power feed. So just understanding those and coordinating those early is something that we're going to find is important as we continue down this journey and start to electrify all our other facilities.
Right. And Cole, you mentioned, the infrastructure bill and some of the incentives in there for vehicle electrification. Are there any similar incentives for the power utility companies, for the electric utility companies, in terms of how they provide power and electricity specifically for electrified vehicle fleets? Is that something that was looked at, or is that something that was kind of sidetracked a little bit?
It's in there. I think it's been sidetracked a little bit. I don't have a lot of examples of utility companies taking advantage of it. What I have seen are some agencies that start putting in some of the substations themselves. So where the utility would meet the facility, as the agency has taken over and saying, we'll supply the equipment, we'll take care of this. Our handshake with the utility is further back. So I have seen agencies, because this is such a big part of the infrastructure that it is now, that they have taken more responsibility away from utility companies to control their costs.
So bus agencies are buying electric substations like they're running rail, right? Yeah.
Some of them are, exactly. And it's funny because most of the agencies that have rail, are more familiar with this. But what I found is a lot of these agencies, that there is a silo between rail and bus that really do not talk to each other, because they really never had to in the past. But now we're seeing a lot more of the bus side talk to the rail side for best practices and standards.
Even in agencies that operate both modes, is what you're saying.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. Just because they didn't have a lot of overlap aside from service, with each other's service. But when it comes to infrastructure, this is now becoming a reality, and it's starting to see a lot of them work together a lot more. Interesting.
What are, in terms of the different technologies, we had started to touch on this earlier when we did the broad overview of what the various types of electrified buses are and are available. But what are some of those quality of life benefits that that electric buses provide? I think it's important to just for the purposes of the webinar, and for folks who may not be familiar or in communities that may not have them, like until 10 years ago, my entire exposure to rubber tired electric vehicles were either airport people movers or golf carts. So it's come a long way. But what are some of those quality of life benefits besides the fact that the power plant is different? Is there anything related to besides the obvious of air quality? Are there any other positives or negatives that need to be thought of or accounted for? I'll throw it over to you, Jen, first. You might have some broader national ideas there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you already touched on it, but the main thing is zero tailpipe emissions. So we're not only dealing with climate change at a macro level, reducing greenhouse gas emissions directly at the tailpipe, but also those local air quality concerns of criteria pollutants. And it intersects a lot with a lot of the work that we're seeing from transit agencies and bus districts, where there's a lot of emphasis on equity in the way that these programs are being rolled out. So wanting to do an equity analysis on where is the air quality the worst, what communities have been most impacted, and where do we want to see those depot transitions to all electric first? We know in New York City that there's 9 times the rate of emergency department visits for low income New Yorkers directly related to particulate matter from buses and trucks. So we know the impacts, we know the studies, we know the numbers really directly there as well. There are also impacts around noise pollution as well, not having a really loud bus or truck on your street. That's also definitely a benefit as well. But air quality really is the kind of top line kind of impact on the local level that people will see. And also anyone can really access an electric bus. It's not the same as maybe a Tesla or a more expensive passenger vehicle. Those vehicles are part of the transition in their own way.
Right.
But
Right.
anyone can hop on an electric bus, and I always like to say that in New York City, our oldest electric vehicle is the subway system that's been around for 100 plus years, and that's across New Yorkers a way that we all kind of get around the city. So that's definitely an important element of the bus space as well.
Noise is something that I think is an important aspect to consider. Like you mentioned, Jen, there's nothing worse than the sound of a grinding gear diesel engine, you're trying to go up a grade, even if it's not all that much of a grade, it feels sometimes. Now, but I have heard, and I'm just, wondering how this is being handled by electrified buses. I've heard in some cases that people do point out that sometimes the electric cars, for example, might be too quiet, and that and maybe this is just a transitional thing, because our generation, we're so used to hearing vehicles, and that's one of the ways that we sort of have adapted to being in a city full of cars and vehicles and internal combustion engines. But are there any negatives seen with how quiet they are, and are there ways they're compensating for it?
On the light duty side, I know that Tesla will put in infrastructure that basically creates a little noise, so you do hear something when the car is passing by you. I've seen anecdotally, taking the B32 in Brooklyn, when I hop on the electric model there, the bus does tell you very loud verbally when it is turning, in a way that the diesel models don't. So you kind of have that element as well that I've seen deployed.
What are the limitations of some of the technologies right now, besides some of the issues with we mentioned earlier, we touched upon earlier, if we're looking for clean energy, a lot depends on how that electricity is generated. So that's clearly could be a drawback. I know it's a point source emission, it's not a tailpipe emission, so some of that can be easier to handle in terms of some of the equity issues like you mentioned, Jen. But what are some of the other limitations? Are there any limitations that are very clear in terms of like charging technology, and when and how fast can we expect that to improve? Or is it something that is not, we sort of need to manage our expectations about how quickly they can improve? Cole, I'll throw that over to you first.
Well, I think the biggest challenge right now with battery electric buses is range. For many transit agencies, one single charge cannot complete a full day's duty cycle for a bus. So you either have to bring out another bus to continue the day's work, or get it back during midday to charge it, or have some sort of opportunity charging out on the street to help it power through the day. How quickly that will be done, I'm not really sure. Proterra just released over a 700 kilowatt battery, which is a big jump from a lot of other batteries out there, to providing extra miles in range. But anytime you put in a bigger battery, that means you need more time to charge the bus at the end of the day at night. We're an industry that's used to having a bus come in and be filled full of fuel in 5 minutes, cleaned and moved on and ready for the next day. Now you start talking about a garage full of buses that need to be charged for 2, maybe 3 hours at a time. When you have, particularly like New York and New Jersey, almost 24-hour service going on, it certainly puts a struggle out there. So quicker charging and bigger battery capacity is really the next steps that we need to really embrace the efficiency of the technology.
And that, Jen, did you want to say something? Did you want to add something?
I just said definitely, so please continue.
Right.
Nodding in agreement. Yeah, that's great.
No, and that adds a question now from a service planning perspective, and sort of my limited exposure, for example, to some of the issues associated with electrification is exactly what you mentioned, Cole, is the fact that with range limitations, the blocking, the scheduling of buses becomes a real concern and a real issue. A bus used to be able to operate the entire day, and no longer. And that has implications on fleet size. That has implications on number of drivers, number of operators that you might need to have. That has all sorts of implications for route length, terminal locations where you might site en route charging, as you mentioned earlier. How has, Aaron, I'll throw this to you at NJ Transit first, and then Sunil, maybe you can chime in with some of the impacts on the MTA. But how has the deployment of some of those electric buses have you had to think about which routes they're deployed on? Have you had to think about where they're being deployed, things like that?
Yeah, so we're starting with limited deployments at, more local routes, city routes, again, because of that range issue. And again, these sites were also chosen because these are communities that have been overburdened by the effects of climate change. So we really wanted to get that technology in there first. But range is, a limiting factor. And
Sure.
we have bus routes that go all the way from Atlantic City up into New York City. So I think those down the line will probably be the last to figure out how we get those buses there. Is it going to be on route charging, or is it going to be a different technology or a bigger and better battery?
And Sunil, anything in terms of how the MTA's service planning has had to accommodate some of the I'm hopefully some of the more temporary limitations as the technology matures, but anything that the MTA's had to do on with New York City Transit regarding the tech?
I really hope it is temporary, and battery sizes start to change and start to increase, and charging capacity and the rate at which charging can happen also starts to increase. But right now, what we've done is, we've had 5+5, about 10 pilot buses in the fleet over 2018 and 2020, and we have 15 buses on property right now, and we are making sure to do the preliminary schedule analysis before they're put on routes. And right now we are managing to that route. So we're not in a position to say that, you can deploy this electric bus to any route of choice. So
right.
That's what we do. And we would expect that to be the state for at least another 4 to 5 years until, either the range of zero emission type technologies increase, which is battery electric to hydrogen fuel cells, or battery sizes increase while keeping the weight at a constant, with better battery chemistries, or a better and faster opportunity type charging at the depots start to happen. So until a lot of this happens, we would have to pay careful attention to the routes that they're on, the blocks that they're running on from the depots and things like that. So that's an absolutely important factor for us right now. Yeah.
No, it's good to know. It's something to consider. Before we dive into more of the detail in regionally, for the New York metro area, last comment on these various technologies. Are there any differences in terms of their costs? And when I say costs, I mean, always thinking like, a 12-year bus FTA plan, right? Not just the initial purchase cost and the capital cost, but the life cycle costs, et cetera. Are these technologies, are there any significant differences today between, for example, battery electric bus or hydrogen fuel cell buses? And if there are, do you expect them to continue? Is the current thinking that they might even out more, or one technology might become more dominant? Cole, do you have any light you can shed on that, or?
Sure. Well, I mean, battery electric buses right now are certainly dominant. Hydrogen fuel cell buses are about 3 to 5% of the ZE market. So those buses to start are probably 20, 30% more expensive. And the other problem with hydrogen fuel cell is the infrastructure is very expensive to start. I mean, you have to buy some way to store hydrogen, to fuel hydrogen, fueling stations, do some modifications to your facilities, even put one bus into service. So whereas by electric buses, it's really inexpensive to start. You could probably buy a couple buses, plug it into your facilities. They probably have the power, but as you start getting to scale, it starts getting really expensive very quickly. So, and all of a sudden, that's when we start seeing people start looking at hydrogen fuel cell buses more. If you look at Foothill Transit out in Southern California, they were 100% battery electric bus. And then all of a sudden, they just started switching over to hydrogen fuel cell buses very suddenly, is because I think they realized when it started getting to scale, they need other things. So, I know we mentioned before that when you're planning for hydrogen fuel cell, for electric buses, to really kind of take it step by step, at a time as you get started. But it's really important also to keep the end goal in mind. If it's 100% electric vehicles scalability, it's important to think about how you're going to get there with the technology we have today and the time frame you do. So, because hydrogen might be more expensive to start, it might be less expensive towards the end. So that's something that I always caution agencies to kind of think about. But hydrogen, the other issue is hydrogen continues to be very expensive. People paying anywhere between $8 to $10 for a kilogram of hydrogen. You generally get 7 to 8 miles per kilogram of hydrogen. So it's very expensive on the fuel wise as well. However, there's also $10 billion through the IIJA that is going towards the deployment and delivery of clean hydrogen. So, boy, if I had a crystal ball,
and there's a lot of moving parts.
There's a
Yeah,
lot of moving parts right now when
Yeah.
it comes to cost and ultimately 12-year cost of the technology. There's also a lot of moving parts. So.
Now, am I to understand, just for clarity, because I'm easily confused, but am I to understand that the way the hydrogen fuel cells operate, they wouldn't have as much of a range anxiety as the battery electric buses? Is that right? They wouldn't have that limitation?
Typically you won't, because it's like a liquid battery, but a very dense liquid battery. Where again, like for 1 kilogram, you can get 7 to 8 miles out of it. If you have a 35 or 50 kilogram gas tank in your bus, that could get you, New Flyers claim 360 miles on a full tank. We'll see once it goes into actual practice, but people are certainly seeing that to be the truth, which is why you're seeing a lot of agencies start trying out hydrogen more.
Great. So let's see, we're already half hour in. This is good. Okay, so we're going to pivot a little bit now and try and discuss some of the issues more specific to the New York metropolitan area. And so we'll rely a little more on Sunil and Aaron about to discuss some of those specifics, some of the highlights and what they want to spotlight. Sunil has a few slides to share from the MTA, which we're going to put up on the screen so folks can see. And Sunil, if you can just relatively quickly go through them and highlight what the
Sure.
what the MTA's current state of implementation is, for lack of a better term, in terms of the electrified fleet.
Oh, I'll be happy to. Thank you. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the MTA as an agency in terms of the number of buses and the depots, where we are with respect to our publicly announced goal with 100% zero emissions by 2040, and talk quickly through opportunities and challenges, and then we can go through a quicker discussion on what might be our next steps. Next slide, please. At a high level, we have about 5,800 buses, 3 propulsion types, primarily diesel, followed by hybrid and CNG buses. We carry approximately 2.2 million riders on a weekday basis pre-pandemic, and we're slowly getting back to those levels. As of last week, we had about 1.5 million riders on our bus fleet, which is actually really encouraging. 329 routes across the city, across all 5 boroughs of New York. And these buses run across 28 separate depots across 5 boroughs. And employees, about a little less than 20,000 employees, with an operating budget of $3.2 million. And primarily, I wanted to talk about the capital plan, because that's what really drives the purchase of our buses. Total capital plan for buses is about $3.5 billion, with this particular capital plan allocating about $1.1 billion for zero emission buses. Next slide, please. So where are we? Back in 2018, we did a public commitment to a full transition to zero emissions fleet by 2040. We started off the journey right away. We worked with 2 major manufacturers, New Flyer and Proterra. We got five of those buses from each of those manufacturers, leased it from them, and it was quite an interesting journey, both for the manufacturer as well as us, in terms of learning the technology, understanding the charging space, understanding standards and things like that. So I thought the first 3 years of this journey was really useful in terms of the learning curve. 2020, we bought our first set of articulated electric buses. Those were the buses that you see running in Manhattan on the M14 route in Manhattan. Those buses are running even today, every day, and we continue to learn from them on a daily basis. 2021, we did a purchase order for an additional 60 electric buses, standard electric buses. They are arriving in the 2023 timeframe, so we are really excited for that. In 2022, earlier this year, the team put out a zero emissions bus transition plan. This was required by the FTA as part of their low and no grant process. Happy to say it worked, and we did get a fairly sizable, actually it's the biggest award in the country, so excited about that too. By the end of this year, we plan to put out a fairly large procurement for 470 electric buses that should go out to the street by next month, in the next couple of months. So that's something that we are all working towards. Looking forward, we plan to build out infrastructure at approximately 5 depots in the 2024 timeline, and buses from the 470 order are going to start to come to those depots in the 2025 timeline. So over the course of the next couple of years to 3 years, it's going to be really interesting in terms of the ramp up and growth there for the MTA. Next slide, please. And we've actually aligned so we have 4 parts of the transition. We have the fleet transition, the facilities transition, the power transition, which is actually fairly large, and of course the workforce transition. And we've kind of slotted each of these transitions along with our 5-year capital planning process. So this gives you kind of a high-level picture of how the transition for each of these 4 components would take place through each of the stages in these 5-year capital plans. Next slide, please. I just want to mention that as Cole and Jen were talking about charging infrastructure, buying buses is one thing. Installing a charging infrastructure before the buses get to the property is quite a challenge. Making sure that the charging infrastructure is deployed within the space-constrained nature of our depots is an even bigger challenge. So that is something that we'd have to manage with our contractors as well as our local utilities. So that's something that we've already started to work on. Next slide, please. This is a slide I wanted to highlight just to show. Actually, Cole mentioned this. Right now, the existing capacity of our depots is about 30 megawatts. Assuming that we go to 100% battery electric bus fleet across all 28 depots, the need is fairly large. In fact, it's an order of magnitude larger. It's about 400 megawatts. That's about the median range. In fact, it's between 370 and 430 megawatts. That is roughly equivalent to about 200,000 homes being lit up at the same time. So, and that is quite a large ask in terms of utility asks. So that is another challenge that we're dealing with and working with our local utility. Erin has to work with 4 utilities, which is really complex. Luckily for us, we have to work with 1, so that's a good thing. But it's still it's a difficult one. Next slide, please. And finally, challenges and opportunities. As I was mentioning, the New York City urban environment is fairly complex in terms of stop and go traffic, in terms of elevation changes and gains and losses and things like that. So buying a bus that is appropriately qualified structurally as well as overall qualified in terms of its performance characteristics is super important for us before we get buses on the property. So that is something that we're working with bus manufacturers on to ensure that not just Altoona structural qualification takes place, but also all the additional structural qualification practices that we've put in place happen before we get a bus on property. So right now, the number of qualified bus manufacturers for New York City transit is between 1 and 2, and we hope to increase that, but that remains a fairly large challenge for us. We did talk about supply chain issues. That is only going to grow as we start to expand on this journey and as different transit agencies start to have the exact same set of goals. I mean, they're all transitioning to 100% zero emissions fleet by the 2035 or 2040 timeline. So supply chain issues are only going to get more and more complex, which means that is something that we'd have to pay real close attention to, especially everybody needs lithium and cobalt for those batteries. So, that's another big challenge. Workforce training is both a challenge and an opportunity because it gives our workforce, it gives us an opportunity to train our workforce in new modes of diagnosing, monitoring, and maintaining buses, be it battery electric or fuel cell. It's always new knowledge, and new knowledge is always difficult to impart, but useful afterwards. So I think that's both a challenge and an opportunity. And lastly, of course, the redundancy measures. If we are going to 100% battery electric, we need to have appropriate redundancy and resiliency measures in place, just in case you have issues with your utility. So that is something that we are looking at very closely, both with local agencies like Con Ed and NYPA, the New York Power Authority. So yeah, next slide, please. I think I've come to the end. I don't want to take up too much time, but these are some of the considerations that we keep in mind as we start to deploy and expand the fleet here. Primarily, what we want to do is service those communities that have been historically disadvantaged and make sure that your buses or your zero-emission buses and your zero-emission fleets are deployed to those communities first, so that they get the advantages of better air quality that comes with zero-emission buses. We also want to make sure that these buses are equally distributed across all 5 of our boroughs. We want to make sure that wherever we deploy buses, you have enough power supply right there, rather than ask the utility for new power. So our first choice would be to kind of make sure that if you're sending these buses to a depot, does the depot have enough power? And we want to send those buses to those depots that have enough power, rather than go to the utility and start to build substations and new power and things like that. And of course, we talked about schedule feasibility. We want to make sure that all of our deployments go to depots where routes and blocks are feasible with respect to the range limitations that we've seen on electric buses. Of course, they would improve and become more efficient, but right now that's one of the phasing considerations that we have. That in a nutshell is what I had. I'm sure there would be questions, but I'm going to stop now and hand it over to Aaron.
Thanks, Sunil. I'll take it first. Aaron, while we load up NJ Transit's zero emission bus page, because NJ Transit's also on track to electrify its bus fleet, and they have a public facing web page that shows sort of what the planning is and where it stands. Let me also add, before I say that we're going to make the slides that Sunil prepared. We're going to share that with folks on the webinar. And also, just so you all know that, there's a quick reminder, I'm sure you all saw it initially, but the webinar is being recorded. So you'll be able to go back and be able to look through all of those elements, one at a time with time, and be able to examine them. Aaron, in terms of, Sunil touched on this, we touched on this earlier, in terms of the fact that NJ Transit has, being a statewide agency, as opposed to sort of just the metro area that the MTA deals with. It has more utilities, obviously, more utility companies to coordinate with. What are the main efforts you had mentioned earlier? Again, in some of our preparatory discussions, you'd mentioned the garage modernization program and the actual ZEB study going on. What are the other zero emission bus study? What are some of those other elements, and how is NJ Transit approaching the transition for the fleet?
Yeah, great. So as you mentioned, New Jersey Transit is the largest statewide entity. We have bus, rail, light rail. For our buses, right now we have over 2,300 buses on over 200 routes from 16 bus garages. So we are looking to transition our zero emission bus fleet by 2040. We have legislation in place that's requiring us that new bus purchases must be zero emission bus. 10% of it must be ZEB. It can be zero emission any technology by 2024. That increases to 50% by 2026, and then 100% by 2032. So we're really kind of taking a tactful and phase approach to this effort. First, starting with our limited deployments. So we have first one at Newton, which we are very excited. Just at the beginning of this month, we received our first battery electric bus. This is one of 8 that will be deployed at this garage. The infrastructure has already been installed there. We have 450 kV charging. These are real deployed chargers, as well as we built a substation in that station, in that bus garage. And so those will be kind of our first chance to really see how this technology will perform under our operating conditions, and will be a real chance for us to learn from this technology, and then carry that through the next deployment. So that next deployment will be at our Hilton garage, which is up in Maplewood, which serves the city of Newark. So here we're preparing already in place of the first phase of that garage modernization is for the infrastructure to support up to 16 buses at the Hilton garage. So the larger efforts at play, besides those limited deployments, is that garage modernization program. So this will survey all of our 16 garages to identify the infrastructure required, the utility upgrades necessary, as well as any construction or other technology upgrades that are needed to support zero emission buses. And kind of aligned with that garage modernization is we have our zero emission bus system design and investment planning study. Very long title, we're just calling it our ZEB study.
That might help. Yeah.
Yep, ZEB study. Well, that's going to take a greater look at all our network and really develop those standards and best practices that are needed to modernize our service. It's going to give us those robust bus network scenarios and investment plans that we can then incorporate into our capital plan and guide our larger scale deployments in the future. So we're kind of taking a phased approach here, but they all interconnect with each other. And additionally, we did receive an FTA grant to reconstruct our Union City garage. So this will we'll be able to build a state-of-the-art facility that can also accommodate zero emission buses. So we're kind of at the beginning of our journey, but a lot of opportunities and a lot of challenges we're looking forward to.
No, it sounds, and in our region, those facilities, those depots can sometimes be their size, where they're sited are obviously things that can sometimes be contentious. And and have community impacts, literally in the neighborhoods in which they're located. Some of them, some of them have been there for more than a century because they were the end of streetcar lines, and they became bus depots and bus garages. For NJ Transit and then for the MTA as well, Sunil. But I'm trying to get a good handle, and I think to help the webinar, the charging that NJT is using now am I to understand it's going to be garage based? You're not doing any, or you're not anticipating right now doing any en route charging, any remote charging at like a layover or a terminal location for a bus route?
Correct. Yeah, we are starting with depot charging. Our ZEB study will evaluate all the different bus scenarios of if we were to have, a full fleet to see what would need it. But right now, starting with the depot charging. And
Sunil, the MTA, I know when you guys were testing some of those buses near us here on the east side, there was the overhead induction chargers, I think, for the M42 for one of the crosstown routes. Right. Is that the tack that the MTA is going to continue to pursue, or is it something more along the lines of what NJ Transit is doing with the depot charging, with the garage charging?
Right. So we have 3 opportunity chargers outside. We have one each on the east and west side of 42nd Street and one at Williamsburg Bridge Plaza. This was built about 3 years back. And the short story is that the amount of permitting, the design guidelines that go with siting chargers on public spaces, and the fairly extensive handoff that happens between various public entities that are part of the process makes for the building of opportunity chargers a fairly complex endeavor, especially if it's on public land. So the thinking right now is that for our immediate kind of expansion for the 500 buses that's coming on the property, all of them would be depot charge based with a pantograph down basis with a ratio of 1:1, one pantograph to one bus, while utilizing the existing opportunity chargers that we have. So we don't have any immediate plans to expand opportunity charging, but that does not mean that we would stop there. I mean, we would look at layover locations as we start to expand and as we start to analyze the next steps. But
no, and that's a great segue into sort of the next part of the question, which is, what are there in any urban environment, particularly, like New York, Newark, Hoboken, Jersey City, downtown Brooklyn, those, those limitations and those issues that arise when you're looking to site any kind of public street furniture, for lack of a better term, right? So public street infrastructure seem to be kind of a high bar. And are there any other elements of operating in an urban area? And we always think of, I guess what I'm coming to this question from, we always think of electric buses and electrified buses as obviously being most suited in an urban area, given, that they may need to operate, given some of the range limitations, given the stop and go nature of the service is, obviously can be much more efficient than a diesel bus, et cetera. But are there any other elements of the urban environment that need to be considered when thinking of those kinds of opportunity chargers? And are there or bus lanes or anything that might that we might view as trade-offs that are associated with the implementation of the electric buses? So
the first thing that, if I understand your question right, I think the first thing that comes
that's
to
my
mind,
fault. I butchered that question. That's my fault.
No. I'm just trying to. So the first thing that comes to mind is that if you're installing opportunity chargers, and usually opportunity chargers are fairly high power devices, which means that the electric sort of substation type infrastructure that comes at a street corner is also fairly large, which presents its own problems in terms of, again, permitting and getting power there and things like that. So I think even that would be more complex in a dense urban type network,
Right.
So that's what comes to mind.
Right. Like I can see that being done more easily at a somewhat suburban park and ride lot.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Or if you're replanning a depot or something, you can absolutely plan your electrical distribution room to be sized appropriately to manage that set of buses, but not in the middle of Manhattan, So yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Aaron, for NJ Transit, you mentioned the garage modernization study, and I know some of these answers might still be pending, given what the ZEB study will say. I just like saying ZEB study. What right now, what are the ways that NJ Transit's approaching the electrification? Is it viewed as a 1-for-1 replacement? Because the reason why I ask is one of the things that always comes up with when you're looking at the service planning elements for an electric fleet is, given current limitations on the technology, you actually may need more vehicles. And if you need more vehicles, you have to store and maintain them. So, my question there is NJ Transit right now, are you seeing electric buses as strictly 1-for-1 replacements for the diesel buses? And if not, are you looking to expand facilities? Is that something that's recognized as as a need to have in the future?
I think our garage modernization will confirm if it is really going to be 1-to-1. I'm thinking it's going to be a little bit more than that, and we are going to need more space and more real estate, which is often we don't have. So I think the garage study will really determine the footprint, and also if we're adding more chargers, that might displace some buses in general. So yeah, it's going to be a complicated effort to figure out how we're going to fit the existing footprint of the garage, or if we need to expand, do we need more real estate and acquire other land, or how can we fit everything within our existing facilities, or do we need additional garages?
Right. So it becomes, in terms of planning, it becomes not just a transit planning problem. It becomes a land use and urban design, et cetera. It folds in all those other elements and disciplines as well.
Definitely.
In terms of, for both agencies, you both operate in the New York Metro. You both operate commuter routes. NJ Transit's somewhat longer. Aaron, as you mentioned earlier, there are routes that go from Atlantic City to New York, Philadelphia to Asbury Park. Sunil, I know the MTA is particularly the commuter routes. The MTA, some of them operated by MTA Bus, some of them New York City Transit, Staten Island routes, Southern Brooklyn. Are there any plans? Are there any anticipation of converting those? I guess NJ Transit, Aaron, they call them cruisers, cruiser buses, those intercity over-the-road motor coaches. Are there any plans to look to electrify even those elements of the fleet in any way, or zero-emission elements of make them zero emissions? And how does that play into the private market? do any of the private operators in the New York region, and there are a lot, the academies and the camps of the world, do they have are they pursuing any kinds of electric fleet plans as far as like similar to that? Aaron, I'll start with New Jersey Transit. Anything for potential interstate bus electrification? Or
I think the ZEB study will kind of uncover that, but we are really first starting with what the technology we have is the battery electric buses with those more local routes. So hopefully the ZEB study will, begin to investigate and assess the technology and the potential for future technology for those longer routes.
And Sunil, anything in terms of the similar, the over-the-road motor coaches?
Yeah, so the first thing I want to say is that, the 2040 deadline remains the same for express buses, standard buses, and articulated buses.
That's a good point.
Right, yeah, so that's absolutely the case. We do have manufacturers that are qualified for both standard 40-foot buses as well as articulated 60-foot buses. But your express buses are in a state where manufacturers are still refining the bus frame and bus technology. That said, I know that Van Hool has a good offering with respect to coach buses. I know that MCI out of New Flyer has a good offering. And we have been talking to both of them in terms of next steps. And I think we should be in a place to start to trial one or more of these OEMs in the next 2 to 3 years, because once you start to trial the express coaches or zero emission express coaches, you can start to put them slowly into operation, learn the characteristics and things like that. The only thing that I want to highlight with respect to express coaches is, while your articulated and standard coaches, buses essentially would nicely align with pantograph-based charging, I believe that the current technology out there with respect to express coaches only allow for dispenser-based charging. So your depot infrastructure may need to change right now. Although who knows, in the next 3 to 5 years, I'm sure express coaches would come with pantograph chargers also. So
no, but it's a current limitation to consider.
Exactly.
Right.
So yeah.
So, and that's good. That kind of gives us, again, now to pivot to sort of the final set of questions in terms of the discussion. It pivots back to sort of a national and global stage, with the state of the industry, state of the practice. I'm going to go back to Cole and Jen a bit in terms of applicable lessons, right? Lessons learned. What from what other agencies have done, and Lance, you've been generously answering a lot of the questions that have popped up in the chat, while we've been talking through the panel. What are some of the lessons that you think other agencies around the nation might be able to impart to the New York metropolitan areas, or something that that we can learn from agencies, especially I guess some of those California agencies that have almost gone to 100% zero emissions buses? Cole, I'll start with you. I see you have your mute off. So
I'll just reiterate kind of what I said before, is kind of tear down the wall between rail and bus. You're going to have a lot of overlap with all this power that's coming in, and it's good to work together and get some best practices. So you generally only find in larger cities like New York where they're that close, but it's important to start making those connections and taking those best practices and applying it.
That's a good one. Jen, you have anything you can add in terms of lessons learned?
Yeah, I think something that's giving me a fair amount of pause or heartache are just the resiliency factors with the zero emission bus transition. We're kind of in a phase right now where we do have fuel diversity across diesel and CNG, and those dispensers are much more resilient to a power outage, much more resilient to what that would look like. We know that AC Transit, I think Lance, you mentioned that in the chat there, that they have a mix of hydrogen fuel cell and battery bus kind of goals, and their fleet's looking to have that fuel diversity, which furthers redundancy. We know Santa Clara Valley and LA DOT for their bus fleets, they're integrating solar on site to kind of further redundancy there. MTD and Urbana in Illinois, that they are deploying fuel cell buses, and they're actually going to generate energy on site there as well to kind of further their ability to handle shocks and stressors kind of going forward. So we definitely look towards them as good examples here.
And of course, New York is the largest transit market and transit systems in the U.S., but we do have global peers. And can anyone speak to what maybe some of our international peer cities might be doing in terms of pursuing electrification, and has there been more, when you look overseas, has there been more of a settling on one of these technologies, whether it's fuel cell, electric bus, or battery electric bus, than maybe we have seen here in the United States or North America? Cole, again, I'll start with you and can kick it off maybe to Lance, and then Jen will wrap up.
I'm not sure if they've really one winner shown up overseas, but one big thing in Europe is for the pantograph chargers. Right now they have, in the United States, we kind of focus on pantograph down, where the pantograph sits in the bus garage and it comes down and charges the buses, which requires a lot of infrastructural work to be done in the garage. You know, if the garage wasn't built for such heavy equipment to be up on the roof of the building, it could be really expensive to do all these sort of alterations. And it also takes away parking space in the garage, which is a precious commodity. In Europe, they're about split, where about half the buses have this pantograph down model, where the other ones have pantograph up, or just pantograph, where the pantograph is actually on the bus and it just connects kind of like an electric trolley line to some infrastructure inside the garage above, where it's much easier to install that in a garage than trying to kind of redo the infrastructure for it. So when there's certainly trade-offs, you need to have more pantographs. Now you're putting it on a bus that goes on route all day, adds more weight. But if you're really space constrained or infrastructure constrained in your garage, it's something that could be looked at, that Europe is doing, that really nobody's looking at in the United States right now.
And oh, did Lance drop off? I think Lance may have had to leave us. Yes, but I think that's a good segue and break point to turn it over to, you know, open up the floor to questions. So Eric, I think what we'll do is you know, we'll see if some folks raise their hand maybe in the Zoom chat. And if there, you know, there were some questions in the chat already that Lance did, like I mentioned, he generously answered. One question that came from Jeff Peel was, are there any examples of agencies that have had to actually change some of their on-street service in order to accommodate the technology, in order to accommodate zero-emission buses? And there were there were some of them have been intentional with considering reducing the length of service blocks to accommodate that technology. And of course, that plays into some of what we were mentioning earlier about the fact that the service planning and the vehicle needs and the drivers needs are something that number of drivers and operators needed is something to consider, especially as fleets expand and the number of blocks needed to maintain the same level of service might be expanded. Again, that may be something that changes over time as the technology matures. But given some of the the labor market constraints that every transit agency is dealing with, it's something to consider. So as Chris Lee mentioned in the chat, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to drop them here in the chat. But otherwise, are there any questions from the participants on the call for any of the panel members?
I really did not have any. I thought this was really useful in terms of having an open discussion this way. So yeah. No,
it's very interesting. Yeah, and there are, like we said earlier, there are a lot of moving parts, in terms of the technologies.
Yeah. The one thing that did not really come up during this discussion is we are noticing PPI price increases across the board for both buses as well as charging infrastructure. I was wondering if the other members on the panel have seen similar price increases from transit agencies, because that's what we are noticing, at least from our capital plan. So.
Good questions from Sunil. Any, Cole, Jen, Aaron, have the budgets of those initial budgets, that were projected for the transition to electrified buses, have they been blown by the recent increases in those producer price indexes? Is that something that you see? Go ahead, Cole.
Yes.
Yeah.
Short answer. With the supply chain constraints and along those lines. And I think part of it is the manufacturers are kind of having to tool very quick, where maybe they didn't think the change to the EU would come as quickly. It is. So they need to kind of change how they do manufacturing as well. So I think it's also causing some price increases for bus manufacture.
Right. And Nikita had a question in the chat, specifically, Sunil, in terms of the MTA. do you have any specific lessons that you can share? Any learnings from the 5 pilot programs from the 2 manufacturers? Anything that was really something you could put a pin in and say, like, this is something that we learned specifically given the pilot programs?
Yeah, so there were, I want to say one, so actually, 2 things. One is, the range was never equal to what was advertised. And that's something that we'd have to, every transit agency would have to understand. And I think most of the panelists actually talked about it. And the decrease in range as the temperature reduces, especially in the Northeast, is fairly drastic. And that's something that we absolutely learned during the pilot, because it's, unless you run a route, you never understand the amount of decrease in range and the amount of extra energy that it takes to heat those buses. And since we want to keep it at 0 tailpipe emissions, we don't want to put anything like auxiliary heaters and things like that on the bus. So the decrease in range was pretty high in terms of the first generation of those buses. It's gotten a lot better now, but that's what we learned as part of that first 5+5. The other thing that we learned, which I think is still kind of relevant, is while you have SAE standards developed for pantograph down charging and things like that, and the standard is broadly deployed across both bus manufacturers and charger manufacturers, the moment you pull up a bus underneath the pantograph for the first time, there is always that communication back and forth, and it's always a hit and miss until a technician comes and figures out what the problem is. So while standards have been developed and published, the intermixing of different bus manufacturers to different charger manufacturers and them talking to each other seamlessly still has not really matured, right? So that's something that needs to happen, and I'm sure it'll happen, but it's still a problem, So
right.
Yeah,
right.
Those are some of the main things that we learned, and of course, reliability and maintainability and availability numbers were fairly low, but then that again can be traced to the fact that you have these small micro fleets sitting in depots, which means that you'd have to have a bespoke set of people who are looking at these micro fleets, which naturally increases cycle times, maintenance times, and availability times. So so these are things that we learned as part of that evaluation. But
no, it's
needless to
interesting.
say, needless to say, both manufacturers as well as us learned a lot from those.
And I've heard, in terms of service planning, you hear a lot about, I've heard it about both extremes, like cold weather and very hot weather. If you're running, other auxiliaries like air conditioning on the vehicle can also induce a range limitation that maybe not as severe as having to heat the vehicle, but that's what I've heard. In the chat, Jeff Peel has an interesting question about joint development opportunities, given that garages, depots in the New York area are, sited on urban land, very high value land, et cetera. Has there been, since the depots will no longer be emitting so many, noxious air quality issues, has there been any opportunities or even being looked at for any kind of joint development with them, residential, commercial of any type? That Jeff mentions in his question that some of this is being pursued in Europe, and just wondering if, Aaron, is the garage modernization study looking at this at all for some of the potential NJ Transit properties, or it's just seen as something to not yet really bring into consideration?
Oh, this is a really interesting point. I'm not sure the specifics of the garage modernization, or if this has even been a thought, but something I'll definitely bring to the group.
Right. So Neil, has the MTA looked at that at all? I mean, there's some subway yards that have overbuilds, right? And I believe Livonia yard, right?
We are absolutely looking at this. We have a fairly large deployment close to East New York happening in the next 2 to 3 years. And there is a lot of planning process underway around reimagining the East New York area, especially at the intersection of the place where you have the East New York bus depot, and you have the the subway station and the maintenance yards there. There's a lot of thinking around reimagining that area, and this is so we've started those initial discussions with MTA Real Estate in terms of how best do we reformat the space? How best do we make it more accessible for public use and things like that? But it's still in a little bit of an early stage, but this is absolutely going to happen as we start to green a lot more of our depots.
Interesting. Well, I think we are almost at time. I mean, we can obviously go a little longer if we have another question. Good, because we can go a little longer if we get a few more questions. Frank Tomaso has asked us: has there been any exploration of sort of a hybrid approach where there might still be ETBs, the good old electric trolley bus, but then with sections that go off wire? And therefore, you can keep the batteries smaller and maybe have some kind of minimization of those range limitations. I know we mentioned we touched on it very quickly at the beginning where we were looking at the overview of the technology that the electric trolley buses. Some cities are still keeping them. I think Cole, you said Seattle is definitely doubled down. I think Dayton still has them. Miami Valley. But Boston has sort of pulled away a bit, and maybe, I don't know, is in Seattle, are they looking at some off-wire segments? Are there things that can happen? In San Francisco, I believe, also has ETBs, and I wonder if they have any pursuits about modernization and potentially running segments off-wire, if there's any kind of battery that can help do that.
I don't know of anybody who is planning on expanding it right now. I think, Boston is definitely looking more towards depot charging. The catenary wires is great, but it's a lot of maintenance to keep those wires up there. It's a lot of expense, and depending on trying to control your energy costs with demand charges, it can be kind of a nightmare to try to control the finances around it. Where it's much easier to control your electric if you're doing depot charging or opportunity charging. So
right.
I don't know of anybody, and Jen, maybe you do, but I don't know of anybody who is currently looking to expand it or introduce it right now.
Yeah, Vancouver has TransLink. I lived in Vancouver for a few years there. They still use the trolley buses as part of their ZEB planning, have kind of keeping those trolley buses, basically the local routes run on the catenary wires. Then they have express routes that typically were articulated diesel buses, and now there's a transition to move that to battery electric. But for New York City specifically, I see the questions kind of narrowing in on our context here. We have an underground wired system for most of New York City, besides Staten Island and some parts of kind of South Brooklyn and Queens. There was a big blizzard in the late 1880s that basically led New York City to bury our electricity wires across Manhattan, the Bronx, and most of Brooklyn and Queens. So would it be adding a lot of infrastructure that we don't already have in place to do a catenary system here? So that's one of the limitations very specific to New York.
Right, that street furniture issue, comes up. John just asked an interesting question. Is there any differences in the implementation of fleet electrification for school buses as opposed to transit fleets? I know we've been basically during the panel, we've been focusing on transit and the transit environment. School buses, I mean, they have two big uses during the day, and then they're basically parked in a yard most of the other time. Jen, can you speak? Is that something that are those fleets transitioning more quickly, less quickly? What are those differences?
Yeah, we have really ambitious goals for the transition of school buses in New York State and New York City. Kind of big picture, there's around 500,000 school buses in the US. 50,000 of those are in New York State. 10,000 of those are in New York City. So having the transition happen here is going to be really key to moving the market towards battery electric writ large. Huge considerations for equity and public health as well. We know children are much more susceptible to diesel fumes, leading to rates of asthma and respiratory illness. So that transition is really important to take place. We also know it's kind of a niche market, right? There's in North America, we have the yellow bus, but it's not a thing you see in most other places in the world. So you're transitioning a fleet where we don't have, China has a huge adoption of transit buses and kind of similar models. Norway has a ton of EVs as well, and their fleets fleets are kind of accelerating towards all electric in the transit space, and Europe and China being the leaders here. We don't have the equivalency for the school buses, so that's just a huge manufacturing quagmire to work through for that part of the fleet. But we know World Resources Institute's really been leading a campaign to transition all of the school buses in the US to all electric, and they've been really huge leaders in this space. So definitely looking towards them as they're pushing for more of this action. But yeah, there's a different kind of OEM consideration of school buses, which makes it kind of interesting to think through. There's no pantograph chargeable school buses to date, as far as I know. There's no inductive charging either. It's really just plug in. There's some pilots that have taken place in Westchester too, a vehicle to grid technology for school buses, kind of taking advantage of that downtime, the downtime in the summer in particular being maybe an opportunity. So there's that element to it as well. But yeah, it's a really interesting space to see transition. And
you just basically touched on John's next question in the chat, which was, the vehicle to grid issues in terms of both, school bus fleets, all the paratransit fleets out there. Chris Lee asked a question about the electrification of sort of the various paratransit fleets, demand response vehicles, et cetera. I think this kind of pairs similarly to what we saw with the discussion of the intercity motor coaches that are also used for commuter services. Is this something that is on a broader, more market-based level, as opposed to specific to the transit original equipment manufacturers? Is this something that a lot of those fleets, I guess what I'm saying, a lot of those fleets are based on a chassis that's built by manufacturers of passenger vehicles like Ford and Mercedes and Daimler-Benz, et cetera. So is that something that is it seen as being that will be adopted as the rest of the fleet gets adopted and all the various air quality laws kick in? Cole, I saw you nodding your head there.
Yeah, there hasn't been a whole lot for transit for this because, like you said, this is basically based on like a medium-duty Ford chassis. But the interesting thing is, you have Amazon and all the delivery services who are also trying to electrify their fleets. So right now, I think the industry is kind of letting them take the lead in developing the technology and developing all of that. And as it starts becoming more applicable in the next couple of years to transit, we'll let them lead on the medium-duty and light-duty stuff. We'll lead on the heavy-duty things and
right,
learn from each other as we move forward here.
Right. And the postal fleet, right? I mean, that was kind of a little bit of a controversy, right? A few months ago in the newspapers and in the media, that the Postal Service decided to, I believe, stick with a gas-fired internal combustion engine fleet, right?
Yeah, but the Inflation Reduction Act has a lot of money for the Postal Service to electrifying their fleet. So they're certainly beginning the process, right?
They're gonna, okay.
Yeah.
No, good to know. Very good. Let's see, are there any other questions in the chat? I don't think so. Does anyone else on the webinar have any other questions for our panelists? We did get one more. Hold on. Good, interesting question. Dave asks, what about the state of readiness and the ability to use electric fleets for disasters, for evacuations, hurricane evacuations, whatever it might entail? Is that something that is considered as part of the fleet planning? I mean, some agencies I know are a very integral part of coastal evacuation plans, depending on, MTA obviously is here in New York, but as you go throughout the nation, any of the coastal cities do rely heavily on their transit fleets as part of the evacuation plan for folks who don't have access to automobiles. Is that something that that gets considered as part of the electrification of bus fleets? And is it a trade-off? Is it something that could be a negative if the electric infrastructure is down because of some type of natural disaster? Cole?
I think certainly Jen hit it earlier with the concerns about resiliency, particularly in situations where the power might go out. So I know AC Transit in California and a couple other agencies are trialing using buses as backup power during emergencies for other facilities, and pull the bus up, connect it to the hospital,
Right.
connect
the
it
vehicle to grid, right?
Yeah. But I do know that in Florida, there's an agency in Florida, forgive me, I forget who they are, but they're planning a mixed fleet of hydrogen fuel cell buses by electric buses, because part of their emergency response has always been to get line workers to where they need to go. with their buses so they can restore power as soon as possible. So they're basically telling emergency response, saying, hey, if the grid goes down, okay, our bad electric buses go away, but we're going to have hydrogen fuel cell buses on there that we're going to use to go get the grid, to go get the utility workers to get them to where they need to be so they can restore power so we can get back to bad electric buses. So there are certainly some agencies, particularly down in Florida, are thinking about it, but I think this agency is a little bit on the cutting edge of it, where I think others are trying to catch up right now. So.
Interesting. Jen, did you have anything to add to the to the sort of the preparedness planning for disasters and things of that nature? Seems like a downer subject, but yeah.
Yeah, hit of a downer to end on, isn't it? Yeah, Cole, you definitely hit on the high points. I do know, just to add to it, that there are situations where manufacturers can extend the range of a battery during and kind of before a major storm. I know Tesla extended the ranges of the batteries for their owners of vehicles before, I think, Hurricane Ian and some other hurricanes down in Florida. There are kind of like hardware facing ways that range can be extended potentially as well, just to kind of flag that the picture could be kind of altered in an emergency scenario. I know kind of everything kind of flies out of the window when you have an evacuation scenario, really kind of all hands on deck.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Cole. So let's see. I think, unless some of the panelists, Sunil, I know you had a question earlier for some of the other panelists, unless some of the other panelists have questions for each other, if there's anything else you want to follow up on, I think we're close to covering at least all of our topic areas, Erica. So I want to thank the panelists, and I'll turn it back over to Erica to wrap things up.
Well, thank you, everyone. On behalf of the APA New York Metro Transportation Committee, we would like to thank all of the panelists, Jen, Aaron, Sunil, Cole, and Lance, and to Will, our moderator, for sharing your experience and knowledge on bus technology. Thank you, everyone, for attending this panel discussion, and we hope to see you at our future webinars. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Good talk. Good, very interesting stuff.
Thank you. Thanks,
Take care.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.